He walked into the startup office with a leather portfolio his wife had given him 20 years ago, his Oxford shoes polished but dated, and a resume printed on cream-colored paper. The 25-year-old founder took one look at him and laughed. "Dude, we need young energy here. This isn't a place for ... double quotes." He didn't finish the sentence, but Richard Chen heard it anyway. Old people. 4 hours later, when that same founder was 40 minutes away from losing a $5 million investor deal that would bankrupt his company, Richard walked back through those doors. And what happened next made everyone in that room rethink everything they thought they knew about age, wisdom, and what it really takes to build something that lasts. Richard Chen was 60 years old, and he'd been fired from more jobs than most people apply to in a lifetime. Not because he was incompetent, not because he couldn't do the work, but because at some point in the last decade, corporate America had decided that 60 was the new obsolete. He stood in front of the mirror in his apartment, a modest one-bedroom in a building that had seen better days, and adjusted his tie. Dark blue, conservative, the kind his father had taught him to tie when Richard was 16 years old and about to interview for his first job at a grocery store. That had been 44 years ago, back when a firm handshake and a willingness to work hard actually meant something. Now, in November 2025, those things meant nothing if you had gray hair and reading glasses and a LinkedIn profile that showed you graduated college in 1987. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. Sarah, his wife of 36 years, was at the memory care facility 3 miles away. Early onset Alzheimer's. Diagnosed 4 years ago when she was 56 and kept forgetting where she'd parked the car, then forgetting she'd driven at all, then forgetting their daughter's name. The facility cost $6,800 a month. Their insurance covered some of it. Not enough. Richard picked up his portfolio, genuine leather, a gift from Sarah when he'd made partner at his consulting firm back in 2008, and checked its contents one more time. Resume. References. Letters of recommendation from former clients. A printed list of his accomplishments. 23 Fortune 500 clients. $47 million in documented value creation, expertise in financial modeling. Strategic planning, turnaround management. None of it mattered anymore. He'd learned that over the past 8 months. Since he'd been let go from his last position at a mid-sized consulting firm that had been acquired by a larger company headquartered in London. The new management had looked at the salary sheet, seen Richard's $185,000 annual compensation, and made a simple calculation. They could hire 2 fresh MBA graduates for that price. So they'd given him a severance package, 3 months' salary, continuation of health insurance for 6 months, and wished him well. That had been in March. It was now November. He'd applied to 143 jobs. He'd gotten 12 interviews. He'd received 0 offers. Today was interview number 13. A tech startup called Momentum, based in a trendy building in the downtown innovation district. They were looking for a chief financial officer. The job posting had said 10+ years of experience in financial management, strategic planning, and scaling businesses. Richard had 32 years of experience. He should have been overqualified in a good way. But he'd learned that overqualified was code for too old. Still, he needed this job. Needed any job, really. His savings account, which had once held $240,000, was down to $18,400. Sarah's care facility accepted payment plans, but only for so long. If he didn't find income soon, he'd have to move her to a state-run facility, the kind where patients sat in wheelchairs in front of televisions and slowly forgot they'd ever been human. He couldn't let that happen to Sarah. So he put on his Coda wool overcoat that had been expensive when he bought it 15 years ago, but now just looked old, and headed out to his car. The drive to Momentum's office took 22 minutes through morning traffic. Richard listened to NPR, a story about unemployment rates among older workers, and turned it off halfway through because he was living the story and didn't need to hear the statistics. The building that housed Momentum was one of those converted warehouse spaces that had become popular in the last decade. Exposed brick, industrial light fixtures, an elevator with a gate you had to manually close. Very trendy, very young. The lobby had a receptionist who couldn't have been more than 23, wearing ripped jeans and a t-shirt that said "Disrupting Everything." She looked up when Richard walked in, and he saw her eyes do the familiar scan. Shoes, suit, gray hair, age. "I'm here for an interview with Momentum," Richard said, keeping his voice friendly. Richard Chen, 10 o'clock. The receptionist, her name tag said Jade, typed something into her computer. "Oh yeah, you're meeting with Kyle and Madison. They're still in their stand-up meeting, so you'll have to wait. You can sit over there." She gestured toward a row of chairs that looked designed more for aesthetics than comfort. Richard sat down, careful not to let his portfolio rest on the floor, and waited. Through the glass walls of the conference room, he could see Momentum's stand-up meeting. About 15 people, most of them under 30, standing in a circle, holding laptops and coffee cups with ironic slogans. One girl had purple hair. A guy wore a hoodie that said "Move fast and break things." They were all talking animatedly, gesturing, laughing. Richard felt like an anthropologist observing a foreign culture. At 10:17, the meeting broke up, and two people headed toward the lobby. A young man in his mid-20s with carefully styled hair and thick-framed glasses, and a young woman about the same age wearing jeans, a flannel shirt, and white sneakers. "Richard Chen?" the young man asked, extending his hand. "I'm Kyle Martinez, co-founder and CEO. This is Madison Reeves, co-founder and co." Richard stood and shook both their hands. Firm grip, eye contact, the basics. "Great to meet you both," Richard said. "Thanks for taking the time." "No problem," Kyle said, but his tone suggested it might be a problem. "Let's head back to the conference room." They walked through an open office space where young people sat at long tables with their laptops, working or scrolling or watching videos. Someone had set up a ping-pong table in the corner. There was a fully stocked bar with craft beer on tap, a neon sign that said "Stay hungry, stay foolish." Richard had worked in corporate environments his entire career, but this felt like a different planet. The conference room had a glass table, uncomfortable chairs, and a whiteboard covered with terms Richard recognized. Burn rate, runway, Series A, user acquisition, mixed with terms he didn't. Growth, hacking, pivot, unicorn potential. Kyle and Madison sat down across from him. Neither had brought any paperwork. No notepads. Just their phones, which they set on the table like they might need to check them at any moment. So Madison began, "We read your resume. Super impressive. Lots of experience." "Thank you," Richard said. But Kyle continued, "We're trying to understand what you'd bring to Momentum specifically. We're a tech startup, moving fast, iterating constantly, disrupting the payment processing space. How do you think your background translates to what we're doing here?" It was a fair question. Richard had prepared for it. "I've spent 32 years helping companies scale, manage growth, and avoid the financial pitfalls that often sink businesses when they're expanding rapidly. I've worked with 3 startups that went from seed funding to acquisition, and I understand the challenges of managing cash flow, investor relations, and strategic planning in high-growth environments." Madison was nodding, but her eyes had already glazed over slightly. Kyle was looking at his phone. Right, Kyle said, not looking up. "But have you worked with tech specifically?" "Because our business model is pretty unique." "Every business believes its model is unique," Richard said gently. "But the fundamentals are the same. Revenue, expenses, profit margins, cash flow. Those don't change whether you're selling software or selling shoes." "Actually," Madison said, and there was an edge to her voice now, "they do change. We're not selling a product, we're building a platform. We're creating network effects. It's not just about traditional metrics." "I understand network effects," Richard said. "And I understand that tech companies often prioritize growth over profitability in the early stages. But eventually, you still need to make money. And you need someone who can help you navigate the transition from burning investor capital to generating sustainable revenue." Kyle and Madison looked at each other. Something unspoken passed between them. "Can I be really honest with you, Richard?" Kyle said, setting down his phone and looking directly at him for the first time. "Please," Richard said. "We're looking for someone who fits our culture, someone who gets the vibe here. Someone who's going to hang out at happy hour and play ping pong and really be part of the team. And ... he gestured vaguely at Richard. "I'm not sure that's you." There it was. The real rejection. Richard had heard it before in different forms. Cultural fit, team dynamics, energy level, all code for the same thing. "You're too old." "I can play ping pong," Richard said, trying to keep his tone light, "and I enjoy a good beer. But more importantly, I can help you not go bankrupt," which is what happens to most startups when they prioritize culture over competence. It was harsher than he'd intended. He saw Madison's expression tighten. "Look," Madison said, "we appreciate you coming in, but I think we're looking for someone with more modern experience. Someone who's been in the trenches recently with tech companies. Someone who understands how things work now." "I understand how things work," Richard said quietly. "Do you, though?" Kyle asked, and now he wasn't even trying to be polite. "Because I looked at your LinkedIn. You graduated college in 1987. That's almost 40 years ago. The world has changed. Tech has changed. I don't think you can keep up with us." Richard felt something inside him crack. Not break exactly, just crack. He'd kept his composure through 143 applications and 12 rejections. He'd smiled through the coded language, the polite dismissals, the subtle and not-so-subtle age discrimination. But sitting here, listening to a 25-year-old kid who'd probably never worked a job that didn't have free kombucha tell him he couldn't keep up, was too much. "You're right," Richard said, standing up. "I can't keep up with you. Because I actually know what I'm doing, and that would slow down your process of learning everything the hard way." He picked up his portfolio. "Good luck with your company," he said. "You're going to need it." And he walked out. In the elevator, Richard's hands were shaking, not from anger exactly, from humiliation. From the crushing weight of being dismissed by people who knew nothing about business, about finance, about the real work of building something sustainable. He'd come here with dignity. He'd presented his credentials, his experience, his value. And they'd looked at his gray hair and decided none of it mattered. He sat in his car for 10 minutes before starting the engine, just breathing, trying to calm down. His phone buzzed. A text from the memory care facility. "Hi, Mr. Chen, this is Rebecca. Sarah had a good morning. She asked for you. Might be a good day for a visit." Richard closed his eyes. Sarah asked for him. That meant she remembered him today. Those days were getting rarer. He needed to find a job soon. Before the facility stopped accepting payment plans. Before he had to move her to the state facility. Before she forgot him completely and he'd become just another stranger in her confused world. He started the car and drove away from Momentum, from Kyle and Madison and their ping-pong table, and their contempt for anyone over 30. He didn't know that in 4 hours his phone would ring. He didn't know that Momentum was about to face the biggest crisis in its short history. And he didn't know that he was the only person in the entire city who could save them. But he was about to find out. Richard drove straight to the memory care facility, not home, not to another job application. He needed to see Sarah. The place was called Meadowbrook, which was a pleasant lie. There were no meadows, no brooks. Just a 3-story building with bland landscaping and a locked front door because some residents tried to walk away thinking they were going home. He signed in at the front desk. The staff all knew him. He came every day, sometimes twice a day, spending hours sitting with Sarah even when she didn't know who he was. Sarah's room was on the 2nd floor, small but clean. A twin bed, a dresser, a comfortable chair by the window. Richard had brought photos from home, their wedding, their daughter Amy's graduation, family vacations, and hung them on the walls hoping they might trigger memories. She was sitting in the chair when he entered, looking out the window at the parking lot, her hands folded in her lap. "Hi, Sarah," Richard said softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned and looked at him. For a moment her expression was blank. Then something shifted. "Richard," she said and smiled. "You came." Relief flooded through him. A good day. She knew him today. "Of course I came," he said, pulling the other chair close to hers and sitting down. "I come every day, do you?" She looked confused. "I forget sometimes." "I know. That's okay." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Richard held her hand. Her wedding ring was still on her finger, though sometimes the staff had to remind her why it was there. "How was your job interview?" Sarah asked suddenly. Richard was surprised. She'd remembered he had an interview today. That was rare now, short-term memory being the first casualty of her disease. "It didn't go well," he admitted. "They said I wasn't a good cultural fit." "That means they think you're too old," Sarah said, her voice sharper than it had been in months. Richard looked at her. Sometimes the disease did this, stripped away the polite filters people normally used, leaving only blunt truth. "Yeah," he said. "That's what it means." "Those idiots," Sarah said. "You're brilliant. You've forgotten more about business than those kids will ever know," he smiled. Even compromised by disease, Sarah was still Sarah, still fierce, still believing in him. "I'll find something," he said, not sure if he believed it. "You will," Sarah said with certainty. Then her expression changed, became distant. "Amy's coming to visit today, right?" Amy was their daughter. She was 26, working 2 jobs to help pay for her mother's care, living in a tiny apartment with 2 roommates. She hadn't been able to visit in 2 weeks because she couldn't afford the gas. "Not today," Richard said gently, "but soon." "Oh," Sarah looked disappointed, then seemed to forget what she'd been disappointed about. "Are we having lunch soon?" "Yes, soon." They sat together for another hour. Sarah drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes recognizing him, sometimes calling him by his father's name, sometimes staring at him like he was a stranger who'd wandered into her room. Before he left, he kissed her forehead. "I love you," he said. "I love you too," she replied. And for just a moment her eyes were completely clear, completely present. "Don't give up, Richard. You're going to be okay." Then the clarity was gone and she went back to looking out the window. Richard drove home and sat in his apartment staring at his laptop. 143 applications, 12 interviews, 0 offers. He opened his job search spreadsheet and added today's rejection to the list. Momentum CFO, rejected cultural fit. Then he started looking for more positions to apply to. Because what else could he do? His phone rang at 2:17 p.m. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, probably a spam call, but something made him pick up. "Hello, Richard Chen?" A young woman's voice, breathless, stressed. "This is Richard. This is Madison Reeves from Momentum. We met this morning." Richard's jaw tightened. "I remember. Look, I know this morning was... We need your help. Desperately. Right now." "I'm not interested," Richard said. "Please, just listen. We have a meeting with our Series A investors at 6 p.m. They're putting in $5 million. But our CFO, the person we currently have managing our finances, he just presented the numbers and something's wrong. Really wrong. Our investors called him out on it. They said if we can't explain the discrepancy, they're pulling the deal. And our CFO quit, just walked out. Said it wasn't his fault and he wasn't taking the blame." Richard was listening now despite himself. "What's the discrepancy?" "Our burn rate projections don't match our actual expenses. It looks like we're going to run out of money in 3 months instead of 8 months. The investors think we're either incompetent or lying to them. If we lose this deal, we're done. We'll have to shut down in 90 days. And you're calling me because? Because Kyle looked up your background after you left. Really looked. Not just the age stuff, but what you've actually done. You've worked with 3 companies that went from startup to acquisition. You've managed turnarounds. You've done financial forensics. You're the expert we should have been looking for in the first place instead of ... double quotes." She paused. "Instead of judging you based on complete bullshit." Richard was quiet for a moment. "I need you," Madison said, and her voice cracked slightly. "We need you. Can you please come back? Please? When's your investor meeting?" 6 p.m. That gives us 3 hours and 43 minutes. Send me everything. All your financial statements, projections, expense reports, every piece of data you have. Send it now. I'm sending it right now. Can you come to the office? I'll be there in 20 minutes. He hung up before she could thank him. Richard Chen, 60 years old, rejected earlier that morning for being too old and not culturally fit, was about to save a company that didn't deserve saving. But he was going to do it anyway, because that's what professionals did. The files arrived in Richard's email before he even got to his car. He downloaded them to his tablet and started reviewing them during the drive back to Momentum's office, pulling over twice to read more carefully. The problem was obvious within 10 minutes. Their former CFO, some kid with an MBA from a good school but no actual experience, had made a classic mistake. He'd been tracking their monthly burn rate, how much money they spent per month, but had failed to account for several one-time expenses that were actually recurring costs disguised as one-time. Things like software licensing renewals, server costs that scaled with users, and payment processing fees that increased as transaction volume grew. On paper, it looked like they were spending $185,000 per month. In reality, once you factored in all the hidden recurring costs, they were spending $287,000 per month. The kid CFO had projected they could run for 8 months on their current funding before needing the Series A money. The reality was closer to 3 months, maybe 3.5 if they were lucky. The investors had noticed the discrepancy and thought Momentum was either lying about their expenses or so incompetent they didn't understand their own business. Either way, they were pulling the deal. Richard understood why. If you can't trust a company's financial data, you can't invest in them. It's business 101, but it was also fixable, if you knew what you were doing. Richard arrived at Momentum's office at 2:41 p.m. Madison was waiting in the lobby, looking frantic. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you so much. Kyle's in the conference room. We've got all our financial data pulled up." "Have your investors seen everything?" Richard asked as they walked toward the conference room. "Not everything. They've seen our projections and our quarterly reports, but they haven't seen the detailed expense breakdowns." "Good. That gives us an advantage." Kyle was in the conference room with 2 other team members, a young man Madison introduced as Trevor, their head of product, and a young woman named Jasmine, their head of marketing. They all looked like they'd been crying or were about to. "Richard," Kyle said, standing up. He looked embarrassed, which he should be. "Thanks for coming. I'm sorry about this morning." We'll deal with that later," Richard interrupted. "Right now I need absolute honesty from everyone in this room. Can you do that?" They all nodded. "Good. Who hired your CFO?" "We did," Madison said. "Tom Bradley. He had an MBA from Cornell, interned at Goldman Sachs, had great references. We thought he was perfect." "How long had he worked in a CFO role before you hired him?" Madison looked uncomfortable. This was his first CFO position. And how closely did you review his work before presenting it to investors? We trusted him, Kyle admitted. He seemed to know what he was doing. Okay, Richard said, sitting down and opening his tablet. Here's what happened. Your CFO didn't understand the difference between one-time expenses and recurring costs. He categorized things as one-time that actually repeat. Let me show you. For the next 45 minutes, Richard walked them through their own finances. He showed them how their software licenses renewed annually but had been budgeted as one-time costs, how their payment processing fees scaled with transaction volume but hadn't been modeled correctly, how their server costs had been underestimated because the CFO had used averages instead of peak usage projections. Jesus, Kyle said, when Richard finished. How did we not catch this? Because you're not accountants, Richard said. You're entrepreneurs. You should have hired someone who actually knew how to do this job instead of someone who looked good on paper. It was a barb, a reference to this morning's rejection. Kyle had the grace to wince. Can we fix it? Madison asked. Can we explain this to the investors? Yes, Richard said. But not just by showing them the corrected numbers. They already don't trust you. You need to do more than explain. You need to show them you've fixed the underlying problem. How? By hiring someone competent. Immediately. The room went quiet. Are you saying you'll take the job? Jasmine asked. I'm saying that if you want your investors to take you seriously, you need to walk into that meeting with a CFO who actually knows what they're doing. Someone who can answer their questions. Someone who can prove you're not incompetent or dishonest, just inexperienced. Will you do it? Kyle asked. Richard looked at him for a long moment. This morning, this kid had told him he couldn't keep up, that he didn't fit their culture, that he was too old. What's the compensation? Richard asked. The CFO position pays $140,000 base salary plus equity, Madison said. Richard had been making $185,000 at his last job, but $140,000 was better than $0. And equity could be worth something if they didn't crash and burn. I'll do it, Richard said. But I have conditions. Name them, Kyle said. 1. I get full authority over all financial decisions. You don't override me, you don't second-guess me, you don't hire your friend's cousin to help with bookkeeping. I run the money. Agreed? Agreed, Madison said immediately. 2. I'm going to implement real financial controls. Proper budgeting, expense tracking, monthly reviews. It's going to feel bureaucratic and slow compared to how you've been operating. You're going to hate it, but you're going to do it anyway. Okay, Kyle said. 3. No more hiring based on cultural fit. If I say we need someone with experience, we hire someone with experience. I don't care if they're 65 and wear suits and don't drink craft beer. If they can do the job, they get the job. Yes, Madison said. Absolutely. Good. Then draw up an employment contract, have your lawyers look at it, and I'll sign it after this investor meeting. Right now we have, he checked his watch, 2 hours and 18 minutes to prepare for the most important meeting of your company's life. For the next 2 hours, Richard did what he did best. He rebuilt their entire financial model from scratch, corrected the projections, identified every error their former CFO had made, prepared a presentation that was honest about their mistakes but confident about their path forward. He also prepared Kyle and Madison for the meeting, taught them what questions the investors would ask, coached them on how to answer, made sure they understood their own business's finances better than they had that morning. At 5:47 p.m., the investors arrived. There were 3 of them. Michael Hartley, the lead partner from Cascade Ventures, Jennifer Liu, his associate, and David Park, a financial analyst who would be doing most of the due diligence. They came into the conference room looking skeptical and irritated. They were busy people. They'd already written off this deal in their minds. They were here out of professional courtesy, nothing more. Kyle, Madison, Michael said, shaking their hands perfunctorily. I'll be honest, we're not feeling great about this meeting. You told us you had 8 months of runway. Our analysts found evidence you have closer to 3. That's a problem. It is, Kyle agreed. And we take full responsibility. We made a mistake in our hiring and oversight, but we've identified the problem and we're fixing it. How? Jennifer asked, not bothering to hide her skepticism. We'd like you to meet our new CFO, Madison said. Richard Chen. Richard stood and shook hands with all 3 investors. He noticed David's eyes linger on him, doing the math, probably figuring out Richard's age from his appearance and experience level. Richard has 32 years of experience in financial management and strategic planning, Kyle said. He's worked with 3 startups that went from seed funding to successful acquisition. He identified the problems in our financial model this afternoon, and he's prepared a corrected analysis for you. This afternoon? Michael repeated. You hired a CFO this afternoon? We'd actually interviewed Richard this morning, Madison said, and to her credit, she looked embarrassed. We made a mistake in our evaluation. When we realized the extent of our problems today, we asked him to come back. He agreed to help us fix this. David was studying Richard carefully. You analyzed their finances in what, 2 hours? 3 hours and 43 minutes, Richard said. Would you like to see the corrected projections? He walked them through everything. The errors in the original model, the corrected burn rate, the accurate runway 3 months, maybe 4, the specific steps they'd take to extend that runway and achieve profitability before running out of money. It took 45 minutes. The investors asked hard questions. Richard had good answers. Finally, Michael sat back in his chair. This is substantially better analysis than what we saw this morning. Your former CFO's model was frankly amateur hour. This is professional work. Thank you, Richard said. But here's my question, Jennifer interjected. How do we know you're going to stay? You're, what, 60? Why wouldn't you take this job, get us through the Series A, and then retire? There it was. The age question asked directly. Richard looked at her steadily. I'm 60 years old. My wife has early onset Alzheimer's and lives in a memory care facility that costs $6,800 per month. My savings are almost gone. I need this job more than any 25-year-old fresh out of business school needs it. I'm not going anywhere. The honesty landed like a physical force in the room. No one knew what to say. I'm sorry about your wife, David said quietly. Thank you. Michael cleared his throat. Okay. Here's where we are. The financials look solid now. The plan makes sense. But I need to see this company operated with discipline. No more amateur hour. Richard, if you're CFO, I need monthly financial reviews. Direct access to you, not filtered through Kyle and Madison, and I need you to implement proper controls. Can you do that? Yes, Richard said. Kyle, Madison, can you work with that? Yes, they said in unison. Okay. Michael stood up and extended his hand. The deal's still on. We'll have our lawyers send over the updated terms agreement by end of week. They shook hands all around, the investors left, and the moment the elevator doors closed, Kyle and Madison both started crying. Thank you, Madison said, wiping her eyes. Thank you so much. You're welcome, Richard said. Now let's get that employment contract finalized so I can officially fix this mess you've created. They laughed, shakily, relieved. I'm sorry about this morning, Kyle said. I was an asshole. I judged you based on stupid shit that doesn't matter. I almost destroyed my company because I thought young people were automatically better than older people. You thought energy was more important than expertise, Richard corrected. And you're not alone. The entire tech industry thinks that way. But you're learning now, which is more than most people do. I want to make it right, Kyle said. Not just hiring you. I want to change how we operate, how we think about hiring, about diversity, about valuing experience. Good, Richard said. Because that's going to be part of my job too over the next 3 weeks. Richard transformed Momentum from a chaotic startup into a functional business. He implemented proper financial controls, real budgets, monthly expense reviews. He made Kyle and Madison justify every purchase over $500. He cut costs that didn't make sense. He negotiated better rates with vendors. He fired the accounting firm that had missed all the errors and hired a more competent one. He also changed their hiring practices. When they needed a new operations manager, Richard insisted they interview experienced candidates, not just recent college graduates. They hired a 47-year-old woman named Sandra, who had 20 years of logistics experience and revolutionized their supply chain efficiency within a month. When they needed a marketing strategist, Richard pushed them to consider a 52-year-old man named Marcus, who'd worked at major ad agencies and understood traditional marketing in addition to digital. Within 6 weeks, their customer acquisition costs dropped by 30%. When they needed a senior software engineer, Richard made them interview a 61-year-old programmer named Janet, who'd been one of the first employees at 3 major tech companies. She could code circles around their young developers and taught the entire engineering team more in 2 months than they'd learned in their combined computer science degrees. Slowly, Momentum's culture shifted. The ping-pong table was still there, but now people actually worked during working hours instead of treating the office like a playground. The craft beer was still on tap, but people weren't drinking at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday. And the young energy that Kyle had claimed they needed was tempered by experienced wisdom that prevented catastrophic mistakes. Within 6 months, Momentum hit profitability. Within a year, their revenue had grown 180%. Within 18 months, they were the fastest-growing payment processing platform in their market. Michael Hartley from Cascade Ventures called Richard personally. I don't know what you did, but you turned this company around completely. We're bringing them into Series B discussions. This could be a $100 million valuation by end of next year. I didn't do anything special, Richard said. I just did what needed to be done. That's what special is, Michael replied. But the real change was happening beyond Momentum. Word spread in the startup community about the 60-year-old CFO who saved Momentum from bankruptcy. Other startups started calling Richard asking for advice. Some offered him board positions. Some offered consulting contracts. Kyle and Madison started speaking at tech conferences about age diversity and the value of experienced workers. They wrote articles for major business publications. They became known as the startup that figured out that experience matters, and other companies started changing their hiring practices. Cascade Ventures made it a requirement that all their portfolio companies interview at least one candidate over 50 for senior positions. Other venture capital firms followed suit. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a shift. Slowly, the tech industry began to realize what other industries had known for decades. Experience is valuable. Wisdom matters. Age is an asset, not a liability. But Richard wasn't thinking about industry-wide change on a Tuesday morning in July, 2 years after he'd started at Momentum. He was sitting in his office, a real office now, with a door and a window when Kyle knocked and came in. "Got a minute?" Kyle asked. "Sure." Kyle sat down. He looked nervous. "So we've been talking, Madison and I, about where the company's going. We're about to close Series B funding at a $110 million valuation. We're scaling fast. We're hiring rapidly. We need more senior leadership." "Okay," Richard said, waiting for the ask. "We want to make you Chief Operating Officer. You'd still oversee finance, but you'd also manage operations, HR, legal, all the stuff that Madison's been handling that she's not trained for. You'd basically be running the day-to-day business while Madison and I focus on product and growth." Richard was surprised. "That's a significant promotion. It comes with a significant pay raise. $220,000 base salary, plus your equity gets recalculated at the new valuation. If we exit at the numbers we're projecting, your shares could be worth anywhere from $3 million to $8 million. Richard sat back in his chair. $3 to $8 million. That was enough to pay for Sarah's care for the rest of her life. Enough to set up Amy properly. Enough to ensure that even when he was too old to work, his family would be secure. "There's one condition," Kyle added. "What?" "You have to stay for at least 3 more years. Through the next funding round or an acquisition, whichever comes first. We need stability. We need your expertise. We need you." Richard thought about it. He'd be 63, pushing 64 by then. Not retirement age exactly, but closer to it. But he also thought about Sarah, in her memory care facility, having fewer good days now, but still sometimes remembering his name. About Amy, who'd gone back to college part-time now that Richard could help financially. About the employees at Momentum who'd learned from him, who valued his experience, who'd treated him like a colleague instead of a relic. "Okay," Richard said. "I'll do it." Kyle grinned and extended his hand. "Welcome to the executive team officially." That evening, Richard visited Sarah. It was a bad day. She didn't know who he was. Called him sir and asked him politely to leave because she was waiting for her husband. "I am your husband," Richard said gently. "No," Sarah insisted. "My husband is young. He has dark hair. You're not him." It hurt every time this happened, but Richard had learned to live with it. "Okay," he said. "I'll come back later." He left and sat in his car in the parking lot for 10 minutes, just breathing. Then he called Amy. "Hey, Dad," she answered. "How's Mom?" "Bad day. She didn't recognize me. I'm sorry. It's okay. I have some good news, though." "Yeah?" "I got promoted. Significant raise. And if things go well with the company, I might make enough money to take care of your mom for as long as she needs care. Maybe enough for you to finish college without debt." Amy was quiet for a moment. Then, "Dad, you did it. You actually did it." "We're not there yet," Richard cautioned. "But we're closer than we've been in a long time." "I'm proud of you," Amy said, and her voice cracked slightly. "When you got laid off 2 years ago, I was so scared. I thought we were going to lose Mom. I thought you were going to give up." "I almost did," Richard admitted. "The day I interviewed at Momentum the first time, the day Kyle rejected me, I sat in my car afterward and thought about just stopping. Stopping the job search. Stopping the fight. What changed your mind?" "Your mom asked me not to give up. One of her lucid moments. She told me I was going to be okay. She was right. She was." They talked for a few more minutes, then said goodbye. Richard drove home, made himself dinner, and sat at his laptop. He opened his job search spreadsheet, the one he'd been keeping for 2 years, and looked at it. 143 applications. 12 interviews. 0 offers until Momentum. He'd documented every rejection, every coded phrase about cultural fit, every dismissal based on age. But now he added a new entry. Momentum CFO gives coup accepted $220,000 plus equity, and below that, he wrote, total applications, 143 total rejections, 142 total acceptances. One time from last corporate job to Momentum, 8 months. Time from Momentum interview rejection to Momentum saving call, 4 hours lives changed. Counting, he saved the document and closed his laptop. Tomorrow he'd go to work at a company that valued him. Tomorrow he'd continue building something meaningful. Tomorrow he'd keep fighting to change an industry that had tried to discard him. But tonight he'd sit in his small apartment and feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not just in what he'd accomplished, but in what he'd survived. He'd been rejected, dismissed, humiliated. He'd been told he was too old, too slow, too irrelevant. And he'd proven every single one of those assessments wrong. Not by being exceptional, not by being superhuman, but by being exactly what he'd always been: competent, experienced, professional, and unwilling to give up. That was the real story. Not that a 60-year-old man saved a company from bankruptcy, but that a 60-year-old man refused to accept that his age made him worthless, fought through every rejection until he found the one yes that mattered, and then proved that experience and wisdom would always beat youth and energy when it came to building something that lasted. Richard looked at the photo of Sarah that sat on his desk, taken 20 years ago, before the diagnosis, when she was healthy and laughing and whole. We made it, he said to the photo. Not all the way, but far enough. Far enough to keep our promises. The photo didn't answer, of course, but Richard imagined what Sarah would say if she could. She'd tell him she was proud. She'd tell him to keep fighting. She'd tell him that age was just a number and competence was forever. And she'd be right. The next morning, Richard arrived at Momentum's office at 7:30 a.m. The place was quiet. Most employees not arriving until 9 or 10, but Richard had always been an early starter. Old habits. He made coffee in the break room, the good coffee he'd convinced them to buy instead of the cheap stuff, and settled into his office with his laptop. His email was full of congratulations about his promotion, from employees, from the investors, from other companies in the startup ecosystem who'd heard the news. What one email stood out. It was from Kyle, sent at 11:47 p.m. the night before. Richard, I've been thinking about the day we first met. The day I rejected you for being too old and not a cultural fit. I lie awake sometimes thinking about how close I came to destroying my company because I was too arrogant and stupid to recognize expertise when it walked through my door. You saved us. Not just financially, though you did that too. You saved us from ourselves, from our own bias and ignorance. You taught us that youth isn't the same as innovation, that energy isn't the same as competence, that culture fit is often just code for discrimination. I'm writing this email because I want you to know something. You're not just our coup, you're not just a senior executive. You're proof that the tech industry has been wrong about age for decades. You're proof that we've been throwing away talent and wisdom because we were too obsessed with youth culture to recognize value. I'm going to spend the rest of my career making sure other founders don't make the mistake I almost made. I'm going to advocate for age diversity in tech. I'm going to push back against the cult of youth. I'm going to make sure that when people talk about Momentum, they talk about it as the company that figured out that experience matters. And it's because of you. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for coming back that afternoon when we called you. Thank you for being patient with us while we learned what you already knew. I don't know if I'll ever be as good at business as you are, but I'm going to try to be as good at recognizing value, at seeing past bias, at building teams that actually work instead of teams that just look good in group photos. You've changed my life, Richard, and you changed this company. And I think you're going to change this industry. Kyle. Richard read the email twice, then sat back in his chair. He'd changed Kyle's life. That's what the kid had written. But Kyle had changed his too. Had given him a chance when no one else would. Had been willing to admit his mistake and learn from it. That was rare, especially in someone so young. Richard hit reply and typed, Kyle, thank you for the email. I appreciate your honesty about what happened 2 years ago, but I want you to know something too. You did make a mistake in rejecting me based on age, but you corrected it. That matters. Most people never correct their mistakes. They double down, justify them, pretend they were right all along. You called me 4 hours after rejecting me and asked for help. That took humility. That took wisdom. And that's why Momentum is going to succeed. Not because you have a great product or smart people, though you do, but because you're willing to learn. Willing to admit when you're wrong. Willing to change. That's more important than any technical skill. And it's rarer than you think. Keep learning, keep questioning your assumptions. Keep building something meaningful. Richard, he hit send, then got back to work. There were budgets to review, hiring plans to finalize, investor reports to prepare, the work of running a company, the work he was good at. The work that, despite what Kyle and Madison had thought 2 years ago, absolutely required experience and wisdom more than it required youth and energy. Over the next 3 years, Richard turned his role at Momentum into something bigger than just one company. He started speaking at conferences about age discrimination in tech. He wrote articles for major business publications. He appeared on podcasts, on news programs, in documentary films about the startup ecosystem. And everywhere he spoke, he told the same story. His story. The story of being rejected 142 times. The story of applying to Momentum and being dismissed as too old. The story of saving that same company from bankruptcy 4 hours later. The story resonated because it was specific and universal at the same time. Specific enough that people remembered the details. Universal enough that thousands of older workers saw themselves in it. That could have been me, they'd write to him. That was me. And slowly companies started changing. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough. Cascade Ventures, the firm that had funded Momentum, made age diversity a formal part of their investment criteria. They started requiring their portfolio companies to track age demographics and hiring. They started hosting events specifically for older entrepreneurs and professionals looking to enter or return to tech. Other venture capital firms followed. Accelerators changed their application processes to remove biases against older founders. Tech companies started creating experience tracks alongside their traditional early career programs. The tech industry's worship of youth didn't disappear, but it got questioned, challenged, pushed back against. And Richard Chen, 63 years old, COO of a rapidly growing tech company, became an unlikely icon for a movement he'd never intended to start. People called him the man who saved Momentum, or the CFO who proved age doesn't matter, or the executive who changed tech's mind about experience. But Richard preferred a different title. One that Amy had given him after he'd told her about everything that had happened. Dad, you're a survivor. That's what he was. Not a hero, not a revolutionary. Just a man who'd been kicked down and had gotten back up, who'd been rejected and had kept applying, who'd been humiliated and had refused to internalize the humiliation. A survivor. On a Tuesday in October, 4 years after Richard had first walked into Momentum's office, the company announced it had been acquired by a major financial services corporation for $340 million. Richard's equity, which had been worth almost nothing when he'd signed his employment contract, was now worth $6.7 million. After taxes, he'd walk away with about $4.3 million. Enough to pay for Sarah's care for the rest of her life. Enough to set up a trust for Amy. Enough to retire comfortably. Enough to ensure he'd never have to worry about money again. The acquisition closed on a Friday in November. Richard went to the office that morning knowing it would be his last day. The acquiring company had made it clear they wanted to keep him on as a consultant, but Richard had decided it was time. Time to step back. Time to focus on Sarah. Time to actually retire for real this time. Not forced retirement, but chosen retirement. The employees threw a party. Momentum had grown from 15 people when Richard started to almost 200 now. Most of them were young, but there were also dozens of experienced professionals, people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, who'd been hired because Richard had changed the culture. They gave speeches, told stories, thanked Richard for everything he'd done. Kyle and Madison gave him a plaque that read, "Richard Chen, the man who saved Momentum by refusing to give up." Richard gave a short speech. He talked about persistence, about not internalizing rejection, about the difference between being dismissed and being dismissible. 2 years ago, I walked into this office and was told I wasn't a good fit, that I was too old, that I couldn't keep up. And 4 hours later, you called me back because your company was about to collapse and you didn't know what to do. Everyone laughed, including Kyle and Madison. I'm not telling you this to embarrass anyone. I'm telling you because it's important. Kyle and Madison made a mistake, but they corrected it. They learned. They changed. And that's why this company succeeded. We throw away experience in this industry. We worship youth. We act like people over 40 are obsolete and people over 60 might as well be dead. And in doing so, we destroy talent, we waste wisdom, and we create a generation of entrepreneurs who have to learn every lesson the hard way because they've systematically excluded everyone who could teach them. Don't make that mistake. Hire for competence. Value experience. Build teams that actually work instead of teams that just look good in photos. Because the next time you reject a 60-year-old with 30 years of experience, you might be rejecting the person who could have saved your company. Or you might just be proving that ageism is the last acceptable form of discrimination in Silicon Valley. Either way, you're the one who loses. The speech got a standing ovation. Richard accepted handshakes, hugs, well wishes, and then he left. Walked out of the office, got in his car, and drove to Meadowbrook. Sarah was having a good day. She recognized him immediately. "Richard," she said, smiling. "You look happy." "I am happy," he said, sitting down next to her and taking her hand. "I have news." "Good news?" "The best news. The company I've been working for just got acquired. We made enough money that you'll be able to stay here in this nice facility for as long as you need to, and Amy can finish college. And we're going to be okay." Sarah squeezed his hand. "I knew you would do it." "I almost didn't," Richard admitted. "There were days when I wanted to give up, but you didn't." "No, I didn't." They sat together in silence for a few minutes. Then Sarah said something that surprised him. "Richard, do you remember our wedding vows?" "Of course." "Do you remember what you promised me?" Richard thought back. 36 years ago, standing in front of their families and friends, young and hopeful and certain they could handle whatever life threw at them. "I promised to take care of you," Richard said, "in sickness and in health." "You kept your promise," Sarah said. "Even when I didn't remember who you were. Even when I forgot our daughter's name. Even when the disease took almost everything. You kept your promise." "I always will," Richard said, his voice rough. "I'm proud of you," Sarah said. "Not because you made money or saved a company. I'm proud because you didn't give up. On me. On Amy. On yourself." "I couldn't give up," Richard said. "Not as long as you still needed me. I'll always need you," Sarah said, "even when I can't remember your name. Even when I look at you like you're a stranger. I'll always need you." They sat together until the sun started to set through the window, casting long shadows across the room. Richard thought about everything that had happened. The rejection, the humiliation, the desperate phone call from Madison, the 4 hours that changed everything, the years of work, of proving himself, of changing a culture one hire at a time, and he thought about the alternative. What would have happened if he'd given up? If he'd accepted that he was too old, too irrelevant, too unwanted? He would have lost everything. His wife's care, his daughter's future, his own dignity. But he hadn't given up, and that made all the difference. That evening, Richard drove home and opened his laptop one last time. He went to his job search spreadsheet and made one final entry. Journey summary. Total applications, 143. Total interviews, 12 total rejections, 142 total acceptances, 1 time unemployed, 8 months. Age when journey started, 60 age when journey ended, 64 final result. Company saved from bankruptcy. Career rebuilt, financial security achieved, culture changed.